Spread the Fire fam, welcome back to SMWX, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ziyanda Stuurman, the author of Can We Be Safe? Ziyanda, thanks so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thank you for inviting me, Sizwe.
This is, there are good books, but there are also timely books. And it feels like this is a timely book. Like when I saw the cover and I saw the title, it feels like you're tapping into something really at the root of what makes our current society tick. Take us through the evolution of this book and how it arrived in its final form in your mind and is now delivered to us, the readers.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the sort of seeds for this book were laid way back in 2013. In my very first job at that point, and I was working at a political risk advisory firm, and that was. I mean, 2013 was a really sort of bumper year in terms of labor unrest and social unrest, and so
every year is a bumper year, Ziyanda.
Every year is a bumper year, right?
But that was a bumper.
That was a pretty big year, and I think a lot of it had to do with the lagging effects of the global financial crisis. And essentially, in that year, we had, even according to police statistics, over 12,000 protests recorded. And some of them being minor and some of them obviously being much bigger than others, and I reported on that as part of my job. And pretty much since then, with my sort of background in political science and international relations, have just been incredibly interested in what exactly causes societies to sort of rupture in that way, and for public anger and demand, really, for services and governance and better delivery to sort of manifest the way that it did. And I think over the years, I sort of toyed with the idea, asked myself it in different ways. And when I then registered to do my first master's degree in conflict, security and development, that was definitely front of mind. And eventually kind of workshopped that idea into my first thesis, which was on police militarization in Brazil and South Africa, which are two of the most unequal countries, in the world, really. And that, ever since then, and from 2017, it's been about reading and writing and trying to comment and trying to really figure out why it is that we can't put our arms around the issue of crime. Why it is it feels like we've tried every single different angle and aspect, and it hasn't worked. From giving the police more money to, giving them more equipment, to changing police leadership pretty much every other day. It's all of those questions have come up, and then they came, were even more front of mind when George Floyd was murdered, and Collins Khoza was killed in South Africa as well. And all of those questions then were bubbling in my mind, and I was a publisher reached out to me and said, do you want to write a book about this? Can you write a book about this? And immediately I said, no, not me. It's got to be somebody else. And I think actually then realizing that all of the questions that I've had, and particularly not just asking them from an academic standpoint, but genuinely from a standpoint of, what can I do as an individual, as somebody who's interested in this, but also just somebody who's interested in feeling safe, in not being afraid of being in my own country and walking around my own neighborhood late at night. And that's really where the book came from. And after a really intense year of writing and editing, this is where we are.
One of the interesting things about this book is that you take a wide view of the entire criminal justice system, all the way through to prisons or correctional facilities, and really foreground this question of punishment and how we punish in our society and who we punish, which I find fascinating. I feel like that debate hasn't arrived as forcefully in South Africa as it should have. It certainly arrived in other places, the US being one. And so I want to take you to, I think it's chapter 8, which is the chapter where you speak about prisons. And this fascinating insight that you bring to us, which is that we realize there's a lot of crime in South Africa, and so we assume that prisons must be full of criminals who've done really bad things. But that's not the case. And then you go through the statistics of who's actually in South African prisons and who gets convicted for what. Please take us through that, because I think that's a really fascinating aspect of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think people genuinely don't realize that a lot of people end up in detention because they don't meet bail requirements, and so they're remand detainees. And bail requirements can be really as simple as not having proof of address, not having any sort of identification, and not being able to pay bail, not being able to make bail. And those bail amounts are not particularly large or expensive bail amounts. In a country where the average wage is 3,500 Rand a month, if somebody's been accused of a crime and they're told that they need to pay 1,000 Rand bail, they're just not going to be able to meet it. It's simply not going to happen. So you essentially have a situation where a lot of people who are arrested for petty theft, for drug offences and drug possession, and other sort of smaller crimes that are not, assault and rape and murder, and other sort of larger categories of crime, are trapped in a criminal justice system that simply is not designed in any way, shape or form to make it easier for poor people to navigate it. And so you find that in many prisons, particularly with the conviction rates at the NPA, the largest level of conviction rates being for drug offences, you find many people who are in prison are those who have a drug problem or who are caught up in the drug trade. And that's if we were, sort of to have a hierarchy of the worst type of people in society, anybody who has a drug problem has exactly that, a drug problem, not necessarily a violent crime problem. And that's where we're at right now. That I think if people were to really dig deep and to interrogate who is in our prisons, they would be horrified, really, at who is eventually convicted of crime, and really why we need to decriminalize or really start working towards the decriminalization of drug use, very much because it wraps up and crushes people who have mental health issues and health issues, and not necessarily drug kingpins as we all would like to imagine.
No, absolutely. I find that it just boggles your mind when you really consider it. Of course, I've also been doing some writing and researching in this area, and one of the things that struck me with that section of the book, but many sections of the book as well, is we've glamorized catching high-profile politicians for corruption, which we also don't do, by the way. But this seems, when we talk about the NPA, the major public debate is the NPA charging high-profile politicians. But if the NPA isn't even doing the basic work of actually just getting together cases to prosecute, the daily crimes that occur in our country, we haven't even got to grips with how broken this criminal justice system really is.
That's 100% true. I think one of the sort of masterstrokes of the Zuma administration, and even in its early days, was to disband and dismantle the Scorpions. That was an incredibly effective unit within the NPA and the Directorate of Priority Crime Investigation. And that sort of work and that anti-corruption work was almost working too well. And you essentially said you essentially had the same people who were caught up in that saying, we need to find an excuse as to why the existence, is unconstitutional or unlawful or irrational. And they've come back in the sort of form of the Hawks. But I think you and I can easily see that they were not nearly as effective as the Scorpions were in their heyday. And when you have essentially political control over, such an incredibly important aspect of society, such as law enforcement, that's when you see the slow but very, very structural erosion of the work that law enforcement agencies can do. Politics has become a deep, messy, ugly part of the governance of policing. And we see that with, feuds. Multiple police commissioners at this point feuding with police ministers, multiple police commissioners, being taken to court for corruption and racketeering and fraud. And that all that does is to signal to us, ordinary people, that there is absolutely no legal accountability for unlawful behavior. Everyone essentially can get away with it, whether they're a government official or literally in the highest office in the land. It's a bit of a free-fall, and that absolutely has an incredibly corrosive effect of how we look at law enforcement. And I would argue that's exactly why we have such high incidence of vigilante violence. People literally saying, I'm going to take the law into my own hands because there's no institution within the criminal justice system that I trust to function and to do its work.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you do, if we go to earlier parts of the book, is you trace some of these persistent inequalities back to their historical origins. Why was it important for you to start so far back? And what are the resemblances that you see between colonial forms of criminal justice, whether that's policing or incarceration, apartheid forms, and present-day forms of criminal justice?
I think the reason why I went that far back and I wanted to ask those questions is that I think it's incredibly key to the central question of the book, in terms of can we be safe? I really wanted to deeply interrogate what safety means and what it means to different people. And in so doing, and in really going back and saying, in literally 1652, what did the police look like? What did the court system look like? What did the prison system look like? A bit of a spoiler alert, but essentially figured out that none of those institutions had anything to do with public safety. The policing force first established way back in 1652, or sort of rough and tumble version of it, was really about protecting colonial conquest. Essentially saying that there are a variety now of competing colonial interests and forces really, at the Cape. And so each force and each group had to make sure that what they had assembled and put together and stolen really was kept as their own. And that's how you had, rural sort of burger forces coming together, or what were called fiscals law enforcement at the time. And similarly, again, with prisons, that was all about cheap, well, not even cheap, but slave labor, really. And that has, again, nothing to do with community safety. So it's about sort of shattering these norms and ideas that we, want to hold, that prisons are for rehabilitation and police are for community safety. They're not for those things. Their origin was not based in that. It was, it eventually created, and that narrative was fused in as the country evolved into, a republic and later democratic society. And so I in that as well, there were so many resemblances, through time and in between what we had in even colonial era and what we have more recently. And I always like to use the example of sort of bookending 100 years of the police service in South Africa, or police force. In 1913, when Proclamation 8 created the police force, you then had a situation where that was also in response to a lot of the labor unrest that was happening on the gold mines and in the mines in the north of the country. And in 2012, 100 years later, Marikana happens. And that really shows you why the police were even created in the first place and whose interests they're always looking after. It's never, ever, ever about, community safety. It's about capital interests. It's about big business and elites. It's about political interests. And in many ways, none of those things have anything to do with community safety. The version of community in that sense is really an electorate to gain votes from and a cheap supply of labor.
And now, looking into the future, because you take us back into the past, you take us into the present. But I think one of the things your book does, which is exciting for me, even if this is one of the implications, because it's not the main point of the book, is you're inaugurating, to come back to the question of incarceration, the decarceration debate in South Africa, in a way, which we haven't really had yet. And it's hard to have that debate here because we know crime is, we're all unsafe, we're all terrified. And so crime in South Africa is just a whole different thing to virtually anywhere else. But yet you still say, look, we need to look at what prisons were built for and what they do, and we can't incarcerate our way out of this problem. Take us through some of your thinking on what the future of the criminal justice system in South Africa could be, or at least should be.
Yeah. I think that, so it's really interesting because in very sort of small academic circles, some sort of form of this conversation has been had. I think of Dr. Kelly Gillespie's work from 2008, where she sort of wrote about a moral type of policing system and what that could have meant, prison system and what that could have meant, and particularly I think in the light of South Africa in 1994, particularly because so many political leaders came out of prison, so they actually knew what prisons were like, and forcefully kind of said they need to change. That call for change has dissipated over the years, and largely I think disappeared. But her work was incredibly illuminating to me in terms of this sort of debate. Look, I think in South Africa we genuinely have to ask ourselves, we're in a really tough financial and fiscal position where, we have so many competing interests that we can't pay for everything all the time. And then, that actually presents the opportunity to ask, in the 179 billion rand that we spend on the police, on the courts, and related issues around criminal justice, what are we paying for? What are we paying for? What are we building? Where are we sending people when we send them to prison? And then genuinely asking, if those rands and cents were spent elsewhere, could we actually change the structure of society so that honestly, police forces and prisons are shrinked to their just smallest sort of version. And in that sense, we're able to fund social programs. We're able to fund infrastructure programs. We're able to fund psychosocial support for many communities that are really dealing with decades, if not centuries, of intergenerational trauma that fuels the level of crime and violence that we have in many, many parts of the country. I just really want people to ask, quite simply, what are we paying for, when we spend all of this money on the criminal justice system? If it's not keeping us safe, if it's not quote unquote incarcerating the right people or the bad guys, and once we ask those questions and once we see for ourselves that there is very little value add at this point in terms of police budgets and prison budgets, where can we redirect that energy? Where can we essentially say, and particularly I think the point that I tried to make is, how do we say to politicians, it's not enough for you to say, trust in me, vote for me, I'll lock up all the bad guys. But rather we should be asking, what are you doing to make sure that people don't get caught up in this extremely unfair, extremely unequal criminal justice system that delivers very little justice at the end of the day?
Well, Ziyanda Stuurman, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX. Make sure you go out and get Can We Be Safe? I read a digital copy, but we'll put the cover somewhere around here when you're watching this. So make sure you get that. We'll add links to it below. And just to say thanks again for joining us. We really appreciated having you on SMWX.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Na 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 na